How many times have you gotten yourself into a position like this where the computer might think you have the slight advantage? It's clear that you have a little bit of an advantage in the position, got a little bit more space, maybe a little bit more activity, but there's no obvious plan to move forward and actually convert that small advantage into a win. Forming middle game plans is one of the things that so many chess players struggle with, and hence the thumbnail and title of the video, I think, holds so many players back from achieving a much higher elo than they're currently at. Now, the thing is with chess, right? Let's take it over the board, I think like 6 months ago or something. Ignore the opening, I like to play lines, especially with the white pieces. The moves aren't important, right? I didn't play this perfectly. Again, not important. The point is that this is not a position where you have an equal middle game and you're trying to maneuver and craft a slight advantage. This is a game where I'm playing a very aggressive gambit opening, and the whole point is to attack, attack, attack. Right? I'm just trying to attack my opponent as much as possible. And by the way, this is a very nice tactic. Black can't take the rook because of bishop to b5 check, uncovering an attack on the queen. White has so much momentum going forwards, and I end up winning this game relatively comfortably. I'm give the king a check. I'm going to take the rook. The point is, this is not what people struggle with. I don't think this is what people struggle with because so many people are so actually quite good beyond their elo's level potentially at attacking. Because this is what people want to do. People want to attack their opponents. It's fun, it's intuitive, it makes sense. You make threats. Here, when I play knight e5, I put my knight into a position where I'm targeting some really weak squares in the position, and I can see that this cannot be taken because of bishop to b5 check. That's kind of obvious. Honestly, it's kind of obvious. And bishop c4, it's obvious. I'm making a threat while improving my position. Queen to g1, I'm avoiding a queen trade. No duh, I'm trying to attack. And I'm trying to get into the weak squares, attack weak squares. Obvious. I give a check. Obvious. Bring my rook in to attack the queen. Centralize the rook. Go after the very weak pawn in the position. Obvious. Again, you still need to calculate and figure out how you're going to execute the attack. But the point is, attacking is kind of easy. At least in my opinion. I'm sure many of you will agree with this. And the game ends in this position. My opponent resigns. That's not what people struggle with. So that's not what we're looking at today. So many people can make YouTube videos talking about how to attack, and I make videos where I talk about my thought process when I'm attacking because it is important. But these are the positions that I think that people struggle with. This I had in an over-the-board game against a 2200. I have a bit of an advantage here. How am I going to convert that? In this one, this is a game that I played online against a 2100. Pretty much dead equal position. The same pawn structure, the same pieces. How on earth do you convert a plus 0.25 advantage into a win? Here, I have a tiny advantage with the black pieces. How am I going to convert that, right? And with these three games that I'm going to go over today, starting with this one, I'm going to go over three key points. Now, there are other points that I can definitely cover in future videos, so if you want to see that, let me know down in the comments. Like the video so I know that this is the kind of thing that people want to see, and subscribe so that when I do post a video talking about that kind of thing, you see it, because there are other things to go over. But the three that I'm going to be covering in this video is pressure. This game is going to show pressure and how you can use pressure to turn a slightly advantageous position into a winning position. Also, I really apologize for the lighting. Let me just try and fix that quickly. Oh no. Come on. Okay, the curtains are gone. The curtains are gone. I don't know if that's better or worse, but okay. In this game, sorry, this game is pressure. Pressure is what we're going to be looking at. In this game, it's going to be a pawn break. Pawn breaks are one of the best ways to change a position because, as you can see, completely symmetrical. In this, it's going to be activity and space. The thing is, with all these three terms, right, pressure, pawn break, and activity and space, they're kind of vague. They're kind of vague. I can tell you that, and you can go, oh yeah, of course. Pressure, just build up the pressure, convert the advantage. Oh yeah, pawn break, just break the position open with a pawn. It's vague, which is why I've got games to show you how what I mean by this. So, game one, let me just put it back to the starting position. The opening itself isn't that important, but it's a perk, peers, I don't know how you pronounce it, defense. And I'm playing this against a 2200 over the board. This is actually one of my proudest games ever, by the way. But again, not necessarily important. We're playing an opening because that's how chess works. Very insightful so far, I know. Again, the opening isn't really important. I like to play these quirky sort of lines. And here, again, I'm not necessarily going about the position properly. B3 is very important to stop the knight getting in, even though this diagonal is weakened by the move B3. Queen C7, DC5, DC5, Rook D1, Knight F6. Here is where I'm going to pause, right? We are clearly out of the opening stage. Both of us haven't castled yet, but we are going to castle soon. And this is an interesting position. We have equal pawns on the queen side and the king side, so there's no imbalance in terms of pawns. Like, say I had a D pawn and I was missing my C pawn, there'd be a bit more imbalance, right? This is very symmetrical in terms of pawn structure. We still have all of our pieces on the board. So the only difference here, really, is that I have quite a strong E4 pawn in the center. I have a bit of pressure going towards H6. I still haven't castled, so I could potentially try and start a kingside attack here. How am I going to make something of this position? I start with G5, which the computer doesn't love. The computer wants bishop to H6, but it changes its mind anyway, because it goes from plus 0.4 to absolutely equal after I play this, because black just castles. And I mean, takes, white doesn't really have anything here. So I think the computer's a little bit wrong with that, to be honest. I go G5, attacking the knight. The reason I did that, let me think quickly. Oh, the reason I did that is because I thought that after knight to H5, I could go something like knight to F4, try and trade the knight off, and then try and push this pawn forward and open up the position for my rook. That's why I'm delaying castling here. Again, this is about pressure, remember. This game is all about pressure. My opponent goes to D7 instead, which is slightly worse. I go H4, not the best move, but I'm, potentially threatening to play the move H5. My opponent castles, and here I'm like, wait a minute. I remember in the game, I sat here in this position. The whole game, I'd been going, I want to play aggressive. That's how I like to play against higher rated opponents. I'm rated about 1980 over the board, so my opponent is a fair bit higher rated. And I realized H5 doesn't do anything. My opponent just gets on the D file. If I take, what am I doing? Even if I could transport my queen to H3, I have no threat. Queen H7, and King F8, and I have nothing. So I was like, I've blocked my own bishop's entry into the attack by playing G5. Maybe that wasn't the best move, but I'm going to make the most of it. And after this, I start to apply pressure. Once I change my plan from attack to forming pressure, I play bishop F4. And bishop F4 is quite simple, right? I'm attacking the queen. So my opponent has 4 options. First option is E5, which is arguably the most natural option, but I was kind of hoping that he would play this. My plan was either to retreat the bishop to D3 or H2. Honestly, probably E3. And the point is, yeah, I just went bishop F4 to retreat. But the reason I wanted to do this was to block his bishop because, like I said earlier, the b3 move weakened my dark squares on the queen side, and black is clearly getting ready to play something like c4 or b4, which could be dangerous. And also, this pawn can't go backwards, which means that knight to d5 could be a very good move in the future with the support of a pawn, a queen, a rook, and a bishop, and e6 can't be played to kick the knight out. So although, again, the computer says dead equal, I think white has some decent chances in this position if black goes e5. E5 is the best computer move. My opponent doesn't go for that. What are the other two options? Well, bishop e5, blocking with the bishop and asking my bishop what it's doing. Now, I did consider this, and I realized I don't have to take. If I take and something like knight takes, black gets a bit of activity. But I can just leave it because my bishop is defended twice and attacked twice. So let's say I go something like h5 now, it's a little bit different because this bishop isn't on g7 to defend the h8 square. So if my queen now transported to h3 and we had takes, after something like queen to h7, it's a little bit of a different story because this bishop could get traded off. Black's still probably fine, but it's slightly better for white. And if my opponent takes, I can just take with the knight, apply some nice pressure, and this is a good position. My bishop could come to h3 as well to put pressure on the knight, and it's good. Again, pressure. My opponent didn't go for bishop here. He could move his queen, but I thought that if queen to c6 happened, then I could play something like knight to d5 because his bishop no longer controls the d5 square. e7 is also weak to a potential fork. And I just thought this was quite nice. The queen is also aligned with my bishop, so something could happen in the future. The queen could go back to d8, but that's very passive, and the computer thinks h5 gives white a good advantage in this position, just because the queen's kicked out of the game. But my opponent chose knight to e5. And I remember sitting across the board from my opponent. It's an over-the-board classical game. Went on for like 2.5 hours or something. And I was like, really? You're just going to let me do this? That's very brave, because where is this queen going to go to break the pin? Because that's an annoying pin. Knight to d5, again, is a potential option in the future. Now, it does mean that my opponent keeps this diagonal open for his bishop. But I go queen e3. I don't want to castle yet, and I don't want to push the pawn because I'm not sure which one I want to do. I don't want to commit without having a reason to. Queen e3 serves two purposes. On the one hand, queen e3 gets me off of the d file, and on the other hand, prepares queen to g3 to apply more pressure to this diagonal. My opponent goes rook f to d8, and I castle. Now I think that it's the time to castle, because I don't really want to take here and give my opponent the d-file. Computer thinks this is horrible. The kingside attack isn't worth it. So I just castle. So if my opponent takes, I take back. All good. Nobody wants to take the other person. Although the computer does like the idea of doing this. Oh, no, not actually the second rook because of knight to d5. But trading a pair of rooks. I don't think that's a very human approach. The computer wants to try and go with b4. Which makes sense, of course, but it isn't the end of the game either. There's still a lot to play for on both sides. But I castle. My opponent goes e6, stopping knight to d5 forever, basically. And then I go queen g3. Now, queen g3 is a mistake because of the move b4. And I think my plan here was knight to b1, defending the a3 pawn. And if my opponent were to take, I'd be absolutely fine. The knight could come to c4. It could just sit on a3 as well. And I've got a decent enough position here. My opponent didn't go b4 though. Although the computer says it's really, really good for black, it's not 100% obvious because this is also still quite scary for black to deal with. So my opponent goes knight b to d7. And this makes a lot of sense. You bring the knight back, give the queen a chance to go to a5 or b6 to break the pin. And you defend the knight. Because let's say I just do nothing for a couple of moves. Black now would have the option to move this knight away if he wanted, or leave it there because it's now very well defended. After knight b to d7, I actually calculated the next several moves, and I do have a video on my channel, which will be down in the description if I remember to include it, where I do a very deep analysis of this game. But I calculated this line of rook d2, queen a5, breaking the pin, and rook f to d1. And here, I'd like to pause again. You can see big pressure on the knight, big pressure on this knight. My two knights and my light squared bishop aren't necessarily doing loads, but they're just holding the position together, right? These pieces are applying some good pressure. And my opponent takes on a3, which was my plan. I went rook takes d7, trying to remove the defender of this knight. And if knight takes d7, which is the best move, bishop c7 attacking the rook. If the rook moves, I win the knight, and white is better. This is technically equal if black finds an incredibly difficult line, and it's actually very interesting. Again, check out the full video after this video is over, where I analyze this game in depth. But the point is, after rook takes d7, I have so much pressure in this position. This is just building up pressure at the cost of a pawn. At the cost of a pawn. My opponent chooses wrong. He plays rook takes d7, and here I just get two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn. But the biggest issue for black is that this bishop is getting traded off, which means that his dark squares are so weak, and if I get a knight to either of those squares, which I do later on in the game, it is game over, and the rest of the game isn't necessarily important. Again, check out the full video if you want to see the entire analysis of this, but point is I get the knight to these squares, and after a tactical sequence, I win the game and convert the endgame. But again, pressure. This is all about pressure. I build up big battery on the d file, a battery on this diagonal, and I'm happy to give up a pawn to try and make something of the pressure. So we go from a position around here where white has a slight advantage, but it's not obvious how he's going to convert it. I continue to build pressure. I ask my opponent questions. I'd argue even h4 applies pressure, because black has to be very careful of h5. Build a couple of batteries on this diagonal and on the d file. My opponent didn't play perfectly at all, otherwise he wouldn't have lost. But pressure makes your opponents make mistakes. And my opponent was too scared to play knight takes d7, because after bishop c7, it's a really tough position. It's not obvious at all how to defend it. So he tries to bail and play this position, but it doesn't work. Pressure, that's number one. Second, pawn breaks. So this game was a Vienna, and again, I didn't play this perfectly. We went into this position where white has a little bit more development. This bishop is more active than this bishop, but the knights and the pawns are exactly the same, right? We both have an open f file. I castle, h3, not necessarily an amazing move, but it just slightly improves my position. It stops ideas like this happening in the future, because I also have the idea of bringing my bishop back to e3 to potentially support a d4 move later on in the game. So h3 would stop knight to g4, putting pressure on the bishop. h6, bishop h4. Again, I'm not claiming that I played this perfectly whatsoever. Bishop g3, queen d7, queen d2. Again, very, very symmetrical. We both double on the f file. Knight to h5 attacks my bishop. I drop the bishop back. King g7, just keeping an eye on the dark squares. Knight d5. Because this knight moved to the rim, it no longer defends the d5 square, so I put some pressure on. Again, although this game is about pawn breaks, it's also, as always, about pressure. There is potential pressure on the g5 square. There is potential pressure building on the e5 square. There is pressure on the f file. This knight is exerting pressure on the position. There's no obvious way through yet, but you need to build up the pieces, putting them on good squares where literally they're just looking at squares that could be vulnerable in the future. Because you need time to craft these positions to be winning. And again, I've got a slight advantage, but how am I going to convert it? My opponent goes knight d8. And this should send alarm bells ringing. Now, what's the point of knight d8? Well, clearly, it's to go knight to e6 and knight to f4. Because if black goes knight to f4 immediately, then, I mean, I could take, probably wouldn't, but I could take. But I could also go d4, trying to undermine the e5 pawn that is supporting the knight. What knight to d8 does is, let's say I don't really do a whole lot of anything, and my opponent does something like this, then the knight is supported by another knight, the rooks are also supporting the knight, and let's just, for argument's sake, say everything is traded. Black has a decent position, decent control of the f-file, probably still a draw, but I think there was a better move for black somewhere in there. Oh, okay, e takes is actually better and shutting the bishop out of the game, probably getting this bishop on that diagonal. Point is, that's why knight d8 is played. But knight d8 takes the eyes off of the e5 square. We have a completely symmetrical position, the same number of pieces, the same color lights, the same color bishop, the same minor piece selection. But white has d4. Because my pieces are, well, the knight on d5 really is a bit more active. These pieces are harmoniously attacking the e5 square. And black is in trouble. If he takes, after something like knight takes d4, look at the pressure. Now everything comes alive, right? And e5 might get played in the future. It's looking kind of bad. So my opponent chooses to go c6, attacking my knight. And here, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call it tactical, but we take on e7, take on e5, and then we take on e5 with the bishop, and we win a pawn because we found the pawn break which was only possible because this knight took a step back out of the game. Because like the next game we're going to be going over is activity in space, and that being the main reason to convert an equal position to a winning position. But that also plays a part in this game, even though I'd argue pawn break is the biggest factor. But that was only facilitated because white had a more active position. Because again, the knight on d8 sucks. It hasn't been given a chance to get to where it wants to go. King to h7, because of course the king is in check. I go bishop to d6. When you have a more active position, typically the tactics work in your favor. Queen e4, bishop f8, rook f8, and here there's a very nice finish to the game, and my opponent did actually play on a little bit, but the game was over after this move. Pause the video and find it. Knight takes g5 check, we attack the queen, we attack the king, we attack the rook. My opponent has to take, we take the rook, the knight is under attack, knight e6. Here I was very, very happy with this move, queen to d3, because it's two rooks versus two knights, but with a queen on the board and the weak dark squares, I'm fine, but I'd rather get the queens off the board. You might be saying, why are you hanging the rook? I'm not. After queen d3, I have rook f7 check first. And after the king moves, I take the queen, and my opponent, well, we play a few more moves, and my opponent resigns shortly after. But it's worth noting that rook f7 check first isn't quite as good because the king can move, and then I can't play queen d3 because the king isn't on h7 to pin the queen 2 and force a trade of queens. If I do this now, my opponent can decline and, I don't know, play something like queen e5, although this is checkmate. You get my point. I want to force a trade of queens, and that's the simplest way to do it. But in this game, I have a slightly more activity. Black has a very clear objective of going after the f4 square, but black makes a bit of a mistake, and a pawn break. A pawn break opens everything up, and my more active pieces come to life, right? So, pressure, done. Pawn break, done. Last game. This is all about activity and space. And it starts off with a Caro Khan. My opponent plays the Briar, and I actually need to do a video on the Briar in my Caro Khan opening playlist. I need to go over this because, to be honest, I used to do this just taking on e4 blindly because that's normally what you do in the Caro Khan. And this is just not that good for black. Don't take, just go e5. E5 is the move. Take the space. White is giving you the space, so take it. Bishop d6, g3, bishop g4. I don't know the full theory here, but just get the pieces out to active squares. Castles, castles, rook e1, rook e8. And here is where I would like to pause for a second. This is a not completely symmetrical position. The pawn structure is slightly different, especially after this trade. But black has more space, right? White is playing more of a hyper-modern sort of setup with the fianchettoed bishop and controlling his fourth rank with pawns on his third rank, and black takes the space in the center. h3, I drop my bishop back. I'm not claiming that these moves are all the best moves in the position. Bishop c5. I thought bishop c5 was a very, very nice move. Now the point is, I could play something like knight to c6 here. That's absolutely fine, but I was a little bit concerned about my d5 pawn with the bishop putting pressure on it, especially if g5 dislodging my knight gets played. So I go bishop c5 because e5 is well defended. I don't need another defender on e5. The pawn can go to e4 in the future potentially anyway, and I'm just exerting a little bit of pressure on the f2 square. Again, these themes of pressure, pawn breaks, activity, and space, they all kind of merge together, but this game is more so about activity and space. Knight g6, hg6, knight b3, bishop b6, makes sense, bishop g5. Here I go knight c6. My opponent goes queen to f3, putting pressure on d5 and f6. And in this position, I played the move rook to c8. Now, I was quite happy with this move, rook c8, because white has a threat. Bishop f6, pawn f6, and queen d5. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. But the point is that white has to try and do something because I have such a big space advantage. My minor pieces are supporting my center. My major pieces are behind my central pawns. My central pawns are dominating the center of the board, obviously. And I also put this rook on an open file. That is an active square for the rook to be on. Although I'm not defending, I'm not stopping this threat of bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes on d5. I'm not defending this pawn. Like, I mean, there is no good way to defend the pawn. Really, the computer likes to move rook e6, and if takes, then rook to f6 can be played, and we set up tactics on the f2 square. So, you know, queen takes c5, bishop takes f2. So you can defend that way, but I decide to defend in a way that's active. Rook c8, takes. My pieces are very active. This knight is not very active. It's completely dominated by my bishop. This bishop is kind of active. This rook is kind of active, but my space advantage kind of nullifies the effect of the rook. This rook is obviously not active, whereas all of my pieces, supporting a central pawn, supporting the center, putting pressure on the position, dominating the knight, and putting pressure on the open file, all my pieces are active because of my central space advantage. So that's why activity and space go hand in hand in this game. And the reason this helps to form a middle game plan is because we're just controlling the center and baiting my opponent into a tactical skirmish that doesn't work. Takes. What's the move? Kind of obvious. Knight b4. We attack the bishop. We attack c2. c2 is under a lot of attack, and these rooks are aligned very, very nicely for us. This knight can't do anything because it is dominated by my bishop. Bishop takes b7 is played to try and attack my rook. Rook c7. The point isn't to take on c2. Although this is still good for black, that's not the point. I want to play knight takes c2. Attack the bishop. Bishop drops back. Knight c2. Fork the rooks. Take. Well, my opponent actually trades the rooks first. And now we're just up material. The endgame conversion isn't too difficult. My whole plan here was basically to put pressure on f2 because I'm threatening rook c2 and white can't really do anything about it. This pawn is going to fall, and this pawn is probably going to fall, and this pawn might fall, although bishop e4 can be played. But the whole point is take the central space early in the game if your opponent allows it. Not in every opening, but in this opening it works. A caveat to all of this, by the way, is you need to know the plans of your opening, typically, to execute an effective middle game, because the same kind of plans exist in a lot of middle games coming out of particular openings, if you understand what I mean. But yeah, the tactics work in our favor because we've set our pieces up in an active way. And if my opponent doesn't take this, let's say c3 is played, stopping this kind of move, it doesn't really solve the issues of the position for my opponent. I have moves like d4, which I mentioned. Oh no, I mentioned e4 earlier, but e4 exists, and because I have taken so much space and my pieces are so active, this is well supported. If my opponent decides to trade on this square, I mean, I can take with whatever piece really, it's dangerous. This kind of thing is very, very dangerous for my opponent to have to deal with, and my pieces are so active, and also my central pawns are a very difficult force to reckon with because they're constricting. Like, this pawn can't move up, and it's forever a weakness because of my central space. This rook can't do that much. Like, it would probably love to trade itself off because white has a lack of space, and if you have a lack of space, normally want to trade pieces. He can't because my pawn is quite dominant, and my pieces kind of just build behind my pawn center. So I think I've illustrated to an extent like how to execute middle game plans with pressure, with pawn breaks, and with activity in space. If there's any key factors you think that I'm missing, then please drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the video that is popping up on your screen here because YouTube thinks you're really going to enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't. Love you guys. See you in the next one.